The Rainbow Magic series originates in England. I found a British edition of Amber the Orange Fairy, so I decided to make this video highlighting the differences between the US and UK editions of the book. Surprisingly, there are a ton of little differences, considering how simplistic the books are. For example, at the start of every book we see Jack Frost's magic spell. There are 4 changes between the two versions. Thick Ice Form becomes Thick Ice Forms in the US edition, which is grammatically correct but doesn't rhyme anymore. Mortal World becomes Human World. This Fateful Day becomes This Day. Finally, they change the spelling of gray. I don't want this video to be overly long, so for the most part I'm going to ignore the minor changes in spelling and common word changes, like changing holiday into vacation. I also won't point out the grammatical changes, because that's mostly adding or removing commas, and it's super boring to talk about comma placement for 10 minutes. So let's get started with Chapter 1. What a lovely day becomes what a beautiful day. They soon found out becomes but they soon found out. They passed rock pools that shone like jewels becomes they passed tide pools that sparkled like jewels. Let's go and look becomes let's go look. Oh, and the placement of the pictures is sometimes different, but that doesn't affect the story. The crab vanished becomes the crab disappeared. The backstory paragraph changes quite a bit. They add the word 7 in the sentence about the rainbow fairies. The next sentence's structure changes, so Jack Frost is the subject, not the fairies. They add a sentence about the fairies bringing color to fairyland, and no color becomes dark and gray. Shall we have a swim becomes do you want to go swimming? Further becomes farther. Something winking and sparkling becomes something glittering and sparkling. Hurried over there becomes hurried down the beach, just in case you forgot where the girls were. Pot at the end of the rainbow isn't hyphenated in the US edition. She put down her beach bag becomes she put her beach bag down. That's kind of a silly change. Stood on is replaced with stepped on. Lots of shells round here becomes lots of shells around here. They always replace round with around. The wind tugged at her t-shirt becomes the wind blew at her back. And this change actually makes sense. In the illustration, she's clearly wearing a swimsuit, not a t-shirt. Shall we go back becomes should we go back. It must be nearly tea time becomes it must be almost lunchtime. The wind suddenly dropped again becomes the wind suddenly stopped. It's not windy here becomes it's not windy here at all. Saw little swirls of sand being blown in the wind becomes saw perfect little swirls of sand being lifted by the wind. Where they'd just been becomes where they had been. Also, the phrase is moved, so it appears 2 paragraphs later. A large scallop shell appeared, much bigger than the other shells, is split up into 2 sentences in the US version. The shell's color changes from pearly white to light peach. The shell's called peach-colored on the last page of Chapter 2 in both editions, so this is a legitimate change. They eliminated a continuity error with the color of the shell. Spilling the little shells out of their hands becomes dropping the little shells from their hands. There it was again becomes Rachel smiled when she heard the sound again. A tiny silvery voice becomes a tiny voice. Sorry, Amber, your voice is no longer silvery. Chapter 2. Oh my gosh, I'm already on change number 30. How am I only on Chapter 2? I mustn't be scared becomes I should not be scared. The UK version italicizes the word orange when Amber says her name. Grasped one half becomes grabbed one half. Amber called becomes Amber asked. Use it to open the shell becomes use it to pry open the shell. Kirsty asked, her eyes wide, becomes Kirsty asked, gently putting down the shell. I'm guessing this was done to match the illustrations, which don't have the shell anywhere. Instead of saying, oh good, Amber says, oh good, that's wonderful news. The shell opening scene adds the phrase, followed by a tinkly giggle from inside the shell, and the paragraph is split in 2. Chapter 3. Rachel smiled becomes Rachel said with a smile. Amber changes outfits. Her cat suit, long boots, and flame-colored hair become a leotard, tall boots, and brown hair. Kirsty and Rachel couldn't get a word in becomes she was talking so fast that Rachel and Kirsty couldn't get a word in. Amber did a joyful backflip becomes Amber did a happy backflip. Do you know what is happening becomes do you know what's happening? She and Kirsty had flown with Ruby to Fairyland becomes she and Kirsty had flown to Fairyland with Ruby. Ruby had shrunk them to fairy size and given them fairy wings becomes Ruby had used her wand to shrink them to fairy size and she had given them fairy wings. Stiff after being in the shell becomes stiff after being in the shell for so long. Trainers become sneakers. Wood is replaced with woods. The pot is over there becomes the pot is right over there. Chapter 4. Bertram's job description gets an extra sentence. He works closely with the king and queen. Bertram's purple uniform becomes Bertram's uniform. I guess the US doesn't like purple clothes for some reason. To stop the rainbow fairies from being found becomes to stop you from finding the rainbow fairies. Have you been all right? Becomes have you been okay? After Ruby says she made the pot into a fairy home, they add the sentence, we can stay there until all our fairy sisters are found. Show her, Rachel becomes could you show her, Rachel? So the fairies are more polite in the US edition. The creamy orange shell becomes peach-colored again. It's odd that the UK version gives the shell a different color all 3 times it's mentioned. The pot's too small becomes the pot's much too small. She began becomes she started. Just as they had done before becomes just as they had before. The word tiny is removed from the sentence about the size of the fairies. Heave it becomes lift it. Was placed becomes sat. I can show you Fairyland even though we can't go back there yet becomes we can't go back to Fairyland for good until we're all together, but I can show you Fairyland. Flew out again becomes flew outside again. Just as before becomes just like before. Drab and gray becomes icy and gray. Began to fade becomes started to fade. Are close by becomes must be close by. Chapter 5. Shivers run down their spine becomes shivers run down their spines. We mustn't becomes we can't. They have ugly faces and hooked noses becomes they have mean faces and big noses. Yes, they made the goblins look less scary, even though the goblins don't actually appear in the book. I can hear something becomes I hear something. A hooked-nosed shadow flit across the clearing becomes a long-nosed shadow dash across the clearing. Oi becomes hey. Cross becomes angry. As if becomes like. Stop them getting back becomes keep them from getting back. Chapter 6. Must have passed really close becomes must have been really close. Shall we try becomes should we try? Bertram leaped forward with a mighty hop becomes Bertram took a mighty hop forward. Straight at becomes right at. After is added to the phrase one more jump. These bits become these pieces of ice. They becomes the girls, and they becomes the friends. We know who the main characters are. Seriously, there's no need to do this. Packing away becomes packing up. Each other becomes one another. A final paragraph is added to the end of the book. The book also contains a preview of the next book. A paragraph is added to the preview intro. Ran down becomes ran across. A stile at the top of the field becomes a fence at the end of the field. In the light is added to the end of tiny rainbows flashed and sparkled. King and Queen of Fairyland is no longer capitalized. I guess royalty is more popular in England than in the United States. Kirsty's parents had stopped becomes Kirsty's parents came up behind the girls and stopped. Kingfisher becomes bluebird, weed becomes weeds, reeds becomes cattails. And that's it for this book. Whew! When I decided to do this video, I had no idea it would be so long. I hope someone out there appreciates it, because typing all of this up was way more work than I expected.